Thank you all again for attending. You may notice that Michael Walker is not here today, although Reuben Miller is tall and about the same complexion. You all look alike. All of y'all look alike. All of you, all with the shaved head. All of you look alike. So Reuben Miller is going to do his best Michael Walker impersonation by being the discussant on this panel, Looking Inside the Prison, Part 2. I'm going to have him come up and introduce his panelists, and then he'll have a few minutes to provide a discussion or his overview of the panel and hopefully get us kicked off with some exciting discussions. So come on up, Dr. Miller, and introduce yourself.
All right. Thank you. Okay. All right, so this is the panel for conditions inside. My name is Reuben Miller. I'm an associate professor at the University of Chicago in the Crown Family School, which is the School of Social Work, and also in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity, and I'm a research professor at the American Bar Foundation. And so the panel now is our conditions inside, complicating labor and control. So we'll hear from Betty Marquez. We'll hear from Gabriella Friday. We'll hear from Gabriella. Thank you. Friday. So sorry. Sade Lindsay, and so we'll just start there. So let's start with Betty.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here, Dr. Eason, for always thinking of me and everyone in this room. So I am an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut. I specialize in sociology and Latino studies. My work focuses on immigration detention. And before I focus in on a little bit of the nitty-gritty of immigration detention, I just want to explain a little bit of my background. So I came to the United States when I was around 6 years old, undocumented. I still very much remember my story of coming in to the United States. And so growing up undocumented until the year 2001 meant that my life very much was about being scared of authority, being scared of talking about status. We were lucky in my family to have papers, documents, but many of my family members do not. And so a few years ago, one of my uncles got stopped in Dutchess County, New York, not very far away from here, and that ultimately led to his deportation. He spent about 8 months in Orange County Jail in New York, and he was pre-diabetic. When he left, he was full diabetic. He lost 30 pounds. He was not able to get any sort of status. The family had to resort all financial status and resources to him, but ultimately he was deported. He remains deported to this day. He has not been able to see his 2 children, and we have not been able to communicate with him sometimes, as he has ultimately fallen into his depression. So when it comes to immigration issues and detention, they're very close to me because they're something that, like many of you may know, it's a personal thing. And so when I got to look at all this data that I have, immigration detention is something that many of us don't get to know what goes inside. So I focus on what goes inside, not by, say, the people who are in there, but mostly what the legal documents say. Right? So the legal jargon is not meant for us to understand, but rather to obscure and to dehumanize. And so I focus on the aspect of my data from 2009 to 2022. I've been collecting audits, contracts, any sort of information that the ICE.gov website leaves, any FOIA requests that have happened. And in this time, I have found how audits, inspection reports from the Office of Detention Oversight often repress voices, often state what happens, but does it in a way that is meant to be a normalized factor of suffering. And so the enforcement removal operations are like sections that exist throughout the United States, and they're supposed to be a line of advocacy for immigrants, but how they function is that they often just hear these reports and nothing tends to go beyond that, right? So in the contracts, as we've kind of seen throughout in the morning, they are sometimes within these state jails, the county jails that are smaller. They're not meant to house people for more than, a few days, but many people end up working, end up being there for multiple weeks, sometimes months. The legal structure tends to increase the time that people are in there, so it means it exposes them to hazardous environments. And so when I look at this data that is huge, I'm talking about like thousands of documents that I have created a code book for. I'm working on several things to kind of make sense of it. I've looked at healthcare specifically and seen how healthcare practices in immigration detention operate in a way that normalizes death, suffering, and just represses voices. So when it comes to healthcare, immigrants often in these reports talk about not having those sick requests honored. Sometimes women express not having their reproductive health care met. We're talking about people having infections and dying from those infections. And so what I started to look at was that ICE doesn't necessarily prioritize anything but as long as a check mark is made in these reports. So if someone dies in ICE, that person is counted as a death. But if ICE contribute to that death and they die outside the facilities, they don't necessarily get counted. So we're talking about, yes, over 200 people within the span who have died, but there's much more deaths that have occurred outside of these facilities. So when it comes to healthcare, often people complain about not necessarily getting care that will treat their diabetes, high blood pressure. And so when we look at the population of people who are in immigration detention, they're majority Latino origin. The number of people from Central America who are now in detention has grown as well. And so having advocates to tell you what medical procedures are, it becomes kind of one of those things where people don't know what is happening to them. So we've heard earlier about reproductive health and people being sterilized. That's why those things continue to happen, especially within vulnerable populations like immigrants of Latin American descent. These death reports of people who have died inside of immigration detention find that nobody gets fired. The only time that I've seen some sort of like demotion was when a person in Adelanto facilities in California died out of multi-organ failure. The person who was a director just got demoted to assistant director. There wasn't any assistant director before. I tried to look for the pay scale, and the pay scale was the same. So there wasn't even, it was just a title demotion, completely honorary. And so there are facilities that are mostly dangerous, but I find in my research that there is no facility that is less dangerous than another. So when we think about some of the facilities up here in the Northeast, like the ones in New York, the ones in Massachusetts, they tend to also create systems that create and normalize violence against immigrants. And so death reports, also there was one person from Eloy detention facilities, that's the one near the Arizona border. And if we think about that, they're usually sometimes picking up people who have been in the desert, who have been already sick, dehydrated, and multiple deaths have occurred from dehydration to rabies, to infections of cactus. So we're talking about things that can be immediately attended to. ICE does have the power to send people to the hospital, but they choose not to. And the reason why is that they have to maintain ICE custody the whole time. So the detention facility also conducts these audit reports, and that's when they ask questions about what's going on. Inspection reports are supposed to be a line of accountability. If you don't pass these inspection reports, you're supposed to lose money. But in the time that we've looked at these particular accounts, there hasn't really been any facility that has lost money. You just don't meet the standard, or you meet the standard with recommendations. And some of those recommendations are things like feed the people. Right, and you would think you would lose multi-million dollars because of that. There has been push from the community to stop funding these facilities, these contracts with county jails, and so on. However, because immigrants are treated within this like civil procedure, there is now less and less accountability in that way, because they're not really criminals. They're in the civil procedure, therefore they're kind of treated as like something different. In the reports, the detainee relations tend to interview people and ask them what they think about them. Usually these are volunteers, so they're going to be kind of asked questions in front of the people who work there, right? And so sometimes they mention things like the food is subpar, we're treated badly by the staff, we are thrown into solitary confinement, and you would think these are things that ICE would investigate. However, in the reports, they have now systemized the framing, the legal jargon, by saying things like, well, they are self-serving, they're not really somebody to trust. So the racialization process is very functional when it comes to immigration detention, and how this organizational failure, which is something that I theorized in my study on suicide, is that these detention facilities operate poorly and normalize these poor operations as a way to jeopardize the lives and the human rights violations. And so immigration detention operates exactly how it's supposed to, right? It's supposed to teach a lesson to people and not necessarily treat them as a civil violation. So when we think about detention in general, detainees don't have many rights. And so we're thinking about the longer people advocate for their rights, the longer they'll be in there. I think the backlog for immigration courts is like 2 years plus. Anytime I think about any sort of like big parade that happens in major cities, I think like Kansas City and their parade during the Super Bowl, that cashes people out of that day, cancels, and then they have to wait another year plus, which is great for people who are in sports, but not so great for people who are still waiting back and time after. Solitary confinement is consistently used as a mental health care structure. Solitary confinement is also used as a gift for people in immigration detention. So if they are placed in a facility that has inmates in it, they will place them in solitary confinement. If someone is having a mental health episode, they place them in solitary confinement. They just use another word. It's called administrative segregation, right? So these different words and how they use them is very much on purpose, and it's kept vague. The use of force and strip searches are a continuous issue as well, where women are more likely to be strip searched than men, and also transgender women are more likely to be dehumanized in that process. In reports that I've looked at with transgender women, especially in the areas of California, Arizona, and Texas, they consistently have violated their rights, one by the staff and the medical professionals that are in these reports. And again, remember, these are reports that they made. So when we ask further questions, I'm sure it's even more murkier and like egregious. The sexual assaults that have happened in immigration detention, especially in like family detention, show how often ICE already knows that these things happen. The Attorney General for these ICE facilities have also said that we know these structures don't work. Like multiple year after year, the Inspection General has said they're not doing what they're supposed to, but nothing happens, right? And so the COVID-19 inspections have only made things worse. They, like us, went on Zoom to do these inspections. So what do we do when we're on Zoom and we don't want to hide the fact that our apartments are a mess? We kind of make it look nicer. So in 2020 to 2023, I have also been looking at how ICE inspections have kind of created an even more dangerous mark for immigrants during that era. So some implications for policy. One is definitely ending ICE. ICE is fairly new. It was created in 2003 to fight terrorism. It is not fighting terrorism. It is fighting people of color in immigrant communities. We have seen these structures not be functional. They don't follow the rules. They don't even apply their own rules. And so how we look at ICE has to be a complete eradication. It worked before without it, and we know that immigration detention is something that is beyond my scope to figure out what a replacement would be. However, how it's working, it's not necessarily right. The restructure of the immigration system is another factor. We can't really talk about ending ICE without figuring out a revolutionary factor of how immigration law works. We've kind of discussed the criminalization, kind of criminal and immigration functions that kind of take the two together. But when we think about the fact that immigration courts are very small in number, we think about the aspects of judges being appointed by ICE. They don't really know what to do. They don't really believe people, especially in those asylum cases. This is something that is a real issue. So in some of my work, I do talk to immigration attorneys, and they completely kind of echo this idea that the immigration court system needs a revamp, right? Unlike the criminal justice system where you are allowed an attorney, having an attorney for immigrants is very much hard, right? So places like Vera have tried really hard to find legal advocacy, but also I think in Texas there was Raíces, which also looks to find and fund legal services. And the other part is immigration reform, right? So if we think about DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, they're vulnerable at each year that there isn't something done about immigration policy, right? So we're talking about over 800,000 people who have given their information to the government. In order for ICE to look functional, they rely on the removal operations. If you ever look at their, fiscal year operations, the thing that they boast the most is all the removals that they've done. So the easiest people are always the most vulnerable. People who've given the information, who have lived, right? And we see some economical benefits to having people have documents, right? Being able to have a social security number, invest in their communities. And some of the issues when we don't invest in our communities and rely on removal are places like Postville, Iowa, right, that deported their entire immigrant communities because of these factory raids, and they were in economic destruction in 2009, not just because of the housing crisis, but all the other things that happened as well, right? So one of the other things that I really focus on is telling the stories as well, right? So people who are in a structure of power to voice and figure out ways to work together. So it's not just like in the academic setting of just like talking about these things, but actually doing something. And I'm very open to suggestions and figuring out how to like figure out ways to make this better.
Okay. Oh, I want to have this. Too much. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Ella Friday, for short, since Gabriella with the accent gives a lot of people trouble. And I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Brown University, duly appointed in the Watson Institute, as well as the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. And I want to say thank you to Watson, Urban Institute, as well as EASN, for inviting me and for the opportunity to share some of my work. So I'm hoping that this will aid to the current discussion, but also add to the abolitionist policy discussion as earlier, because I did see quite a bit of overlap. But to start, my scholarship sits at the intersection of three interrelated foci. 1, jails and imprisonment. 2, time and social inequalities. And 3, engage qualitative methods. I seek to understand how time is used to create and entrench social inequalities, particularly along racialized, gendered, and sexual lines. I historically situate my work within a theoretical and deep understanding of the transformation of time itself with the rise, evolution, and afterlives of colonization and capitalism. With this as the backdrop, I use innovative qualitative methods to understand how gendered and racialized bodies experience the temporal rupture of imprisonment in contemporary carceral spaces. My book project, Weaponizing and Resisting Time, Jails, Women, and the Temporalities of Abolition, addresses how women in upstate New York articulated time was wielded, manipulated, and weaponized against them in ways unique to the liminal space of a rural jail. Through our discussions, they articulated this weaponization was exacerbated for queer women, racialized women, and women who refuse to accept their mistreatment or conditions. Moreover, their narratives expose how jails are profoundly gendered spaces that treat women as an afterthought. Though I initially sought to understand how women experience time in jails, I quickly learned they resisted it. They filled, imbued with meaning, and resisted the time of imprisonment in a space predicated on dehumanization and idleness. Finally, I explore how these interpersonal tactics fed into interpersonal and community organizing alongside community organization, justice and unity for the Southern Tier. Our collective efforts were aimed at alleviating the conditions people face in the jail. Yet, some of you may be asking, why time? Oops, wrong buttons. Boop, boop. I know I need to keep it brief, but I wouldn't be an ethnographer if I didn't sneak in a lengthy quote. Kamisi is a transgender Black woman from the Broome community who found herself in and out of a jail prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. She is also one of the founding members of the community organization that made this research and work possible. In our interview, she poignantly uses air to describe the difference between time inside the jail and the outside world. She says, like time on the outside doesn't move unless you make it move. Obviously, that's not true because time is inevitable. I always say on the outside, there are so many different things, so many different stimuli that time moves on its own. While incarcerated, it's a weird thing to say, but you can feel the time. Time is tangible, almost in the way that air, like if it's room temperature, sometimes you have a hard time feeling the air around you, but once it gets hot or cold, like it is right now, you feel the air around you. That's how I think of incarceration. So being out, it's like room temperature. You don't really feel it, but on the inside, you can feel the time all around you, and you can feel the time all around you almost, and it's just stagnant. With that in mind, I take you to the questions that guided my research. First, I wanted to understand how is time experienced in the jail context, because current literature so often focuses on prisons. I also wanted to understand how do the structures of jails weaponize time to enact punishment along gendered, heteronormative, and racialized lines. Third, I wanted to understand how do incarcerated women exert agency to resist the weaponization of time from the jail's institutional practices. And then last, but definitely not least, how can community organizations collaborate with incarcerated people to alleviate their immediate and long-term conditions? I keep clicking the wrong button to go next. Anyway, so I know a lot of us are carceral scholars here, but I did want to just highlight some key differences between jails and prisons because they are often presented as conflated spaces. Jails almost double the number of prisons in the United States, and they're typically for people who are awaiting sentences or for periods of less than a year. They are typically ran by local government or municipal governments, while prisons are ran by state or federal governments. And jails incarcerate people within their own community and also have people working within them from their own community. Jails are typically a more transient population, and they also have limited programming and resources, if any, which is one of the major issues that a lot of the women I worked with faced. Again. Which takes you to the research site. Oh no, it's cutting off. Sorry, guys. So the research site was the Broome County Jail, and much of this, and the jail has a long history of abuses, lawsuits, and questionable deaths. It is regularly close to or at capacity, which is a symptom of the county's over-incarceration of its citizens, which outpaces New York City by almost double per 100,000. 75% of the people detained in the jail are awaiting sentencing for moral crimes or crimes of poverty. Most people spend 8 months or longer awaiting sentencing in the jail, which was extended by a year for many due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Broome County Jail is also highly racialized, as Black residents make up approximately 5% of the population and almost 30% of jail admittances. Okay. This research pulls from advocacy work with over 60 women, 22 of which I followed their cases closely. At the time of our first meeting, the overwhelming majority of the women were awaiting sentencing for parole violations, nonviolent crimes, or drug-related offenses. I met currently and formerly incarcerated women through snowball sampling and word of mouth in the Broome County community. I work with many of these women regularly, conducting weekly or bi-weekly visitations for months at a time. The most extended, consistent interaction was for about 8 months, while the shortest was for 1 week. The longest overall interaction I had was for 2 years, as a few of the women I worked with went in and out of the jail several times. I conducted in-person visits from February 2018 all the way through March 2020. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, it brought much of the criminal justice system to the standstill, and we pivoted to virtual interactions from June 2020 through July 2022 via an online system called Getting Out. Though very poorly named, the Getting Out system creates what Ellis calls a porous institution where we could assess needs, plans, and act. I conducted this research alongside advocacy group Justice and Unity for the Southern Tier, and access to the jail was possible through them. Justice is one of the few organizations doing advocacy work in upstate New York and is at the forefront of publicizing often overlooked injustices. Volunteers took note of grievances, provided acceptable goods, checked on the overall well-being of people in the jail. They also organized and educated the community, held local officials accountable, and provided reentry services to those returning to the Broome County community from nearby jails or prisons. They also hosted rallies in solidarity with people, especially surrounding the alarming numbers of deaths over the last 20 years. Building on the work of insurgent and engaged ethnographers, I understood the violence of incarceration and actively worked to undermine its prevalence in the Broome community. I melded my privileged position as an ethnographer with community interests and community-led initiatives. I worked as an active practitioner in combating imprisonment at various levels and spaces in Broome County. I moved between activist and academic responsibilities with a critical discernment. I took on a number of informal and formal roles within the movement, informal roles such as book coordinator, legal and medical researcher, community organizer, protest marshal, or just a confidant. I also took on formal roles such as volunteer visitor, the women's issues coordinator, and now I currently serve as a board member for Justice and Unity for the Southern Tier. So from the advocacy efforts and discussions, interviews, and longstanding visitations with women, they articulated that time was weaponized against them. By this, I mean time and time structures were used and manipulated to create a temporal regime of torment and degradation in the jail. This can be seen at 3 levels. First, the social construction of time itself. The temporal rupture of imprisonment brought women face to face with something that that many scholars would argue is a taken for granted aspect of society. We don't readily think about how often we interact with the clock and how much it structures our lives. Also, the uncertainty and lack of activity that was innate to jail spaces, what one woman called the wasting away of time, altered many women's decisions makings and put them even closer face to face with the clock. Moreover, most of the women I worked with were mothers, and so they were actively missing time they could not get back on the outside with family members and children that were going through pivotal points of development. The second level was at through state and facility policies. Once one enters the jail, you are subject to the jail's temporal regime, time structures, and schedules. There's punitive time structures and windows, specifically surrounding visitation and grievances. Good time and sentences for early release, but the flip side of that is the possibility of losing this good time. And women, particularly, were structurally given less opportunities to break up the time via means such as visitation and labor. And then finally, at the last level, something that has been very well documented, and I hope that my work adds to, is how correctional actors and facility actors exacerbate the time inside. Correctional staff and other facility actors often worsen the time through cruel and timeliness precision, such as cutting off our visitation at the exact second that we had run out of time, elongated punishments that took hours and hours instead of just a simple, hey, you messed up. Racialized waiting for medical needs or other various services, as well as other temporal consequences. Yet, even against such an omnipotent and temporal regime, it became evident that the women actively resisted the time of imprisonment through intrapersonal tactics, interpersonal solidarity, and community organizing. It was evident in the way they supported one another, produced or participated in ego-affirming activities, created periods and spaces of joy, and ultimately combated the dehumanization of the jail. From these humanizing efforts bore collective efforts to undermine the jail's temporal regime, namely, with a little effort and risk, people in prison can transition from passive resistance to outright insubordination. Okay, cool. The women's interpersonal solidarity efforts were infectious and spread to Justice and Unity for the Southern Tier, who organized around their needs. We hosted community education workshops, conducted research, and published findings on the jail in community pamphlets. We hosted protests and rallies in solidarity with people in the jail, and we also created mutual aid programs funded by community support and ran by community members. Finally, we aided in and filed successful lawsuits against the jail to change policy and ensure protections for people held at the Broome County Jail. So by way of community education, you can actually see these are some of the flyers, pamphlets, gotta stay by the mic, sorry. These are some of the flyers, pamphlets, and things that we had created to kind of help educate the community and try to hold elected officials accountable. There was a lot of instances of voyeurism that women had been reaching out to me, and so we created a post on Instagram. Here you can see, sorry, I'm gonna just come away from the mic. The Just the Facts here, as well as this Warned Women, is actually something that we publish annually to kind of let people know what's going on currently in the jail based off of FOIA statistics. And kind of getting the community engaged and understanding what's really going on that in a space that is often kind of veiled. We also conducted a number of solidarity protests, particularly surrounding the efforts following the George Floyd protests. And here you can actually see some of the instances where we were right outside the jail. That's a police line from right outside the jail. As well as some instances or protests from regarding the voyeurism that we had been receiving complaints about. And during one of our solidarity protests outside the jail, one of the women I was working with the following day, we were kind of stopped by police, which you can see in that line up there. But we started chanting and yelling and trying to offer our support as much as possible. And when I spoke with that woman the next day, she said, "We could hear you from the jail. Thank you." But it's not just enough to educate the community and host protests, right? We had numerous instances of people telling us what they needed inside the jail, and so it took form of also mutual aid efforts. We had already had the visitation program handled, but once the pandemic took hold, we needed other ways and new ways to start meeting with people, which unfortunately cost quite a bit of money, about 25 cents per minute or 25 cents per message. And so through community funds, we organized the video call project, which allowed us to go ahead and encourage students from the Broome County, or from Binghamton, as well as Broome County Community College, as well as people in the community, to actually conduct visitations and start taking notes of what's going on inside so we could start hopefully filing lawsuits and preparing cases. We also started to host the Book of the Month program, which basically so many people reached out to us saying, hey, we want something to read, and especially once the pandemic hit, when there was even less activity going on in the jail, it became a necessity. And so here on the right, you can actually see some of the books that we've sent in. Since its start in 2021, I want to say we've sent in over 1,500 books. And then last but definitely not least, there's the Walk With Me program, which is a program that was created by JUST to help reentry efforts. And so basically, once someone is released and back into the community, it used to be Roseanne, but now it's Shamice, who are both formerly incarcerated women. We'll pick them up, help them get Social Security cards, a phone, clothes, lodging, all of the things that they would need to help fully reintegrate back into society. And let me see. And then last but definitely not least, in aiding into these policy implications, is from the efforts that we did, we started taking note of everything that was going on in the jail and keeping track of all of those things. And with that, we were able to aid into a couple of successful lawsuits. First on the right, on the right here, you can see that there was a woman named Michaela Holland, who was a transgender woman in the jail who had received a great level of abuse and was being denied her hormone therapy treatment. And through some of the narratives that we pulled together, the NYCLU was able to sue, and the settlement established one of the strongest policies in the country protecting the rights of transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary and intersex people in custody. We also had a similar case with Tejan Vega, who was an Afro-Latino man who was abused and beaten by guards inside the jail, and we were able to use some of the narratives that we had received from him as well for his lawsuit with legal services. But I think the thing that we are most proud of is, though we did pivot very quickly to virtual interactions, we wanted to be able to open the jail back up to people after we'd been living with COVID for quite some time. And so we actually sued the jail to reopen to in-person visitation, and won. Which brings me to impactful research. So these are some of the thank yous and the messages that we've received from family members and people inside the jail. And the one I really want to highlight is the one in the middle. So after we had sued the jail and won to reopen to in-person visitation, we received a message from a woman in Chemung County, another upstate county. And she said she wanted to know, how can we get Chemung County to reopen their jail, basically. And so we put her in contact with a lawyer that we use through Legal Services of Central New York. And she wrote us saying, thank you for pointing me in the direction of the lawyer that helped you reopen visits in Broome. He was able to write a letter to the sheriff in Chemung and get visits reopened as of this Friday. Total credit can't fall on him, because I never would have known how to make it happen had I not come across you guys. From the bottom of my heart and all of the inmates whose lives you've drastically changed, thank you so much. Okay. So I explored how time is weaponized against incarcerated women and how they resisted said time. Time acted as a force against the women, how guards manipulated time to minimize contact with the outside world, how waiting was used as punishment for them and their families, or how visits was cut off from the authority of the clock in person and virtually. Moreover, the rule of law was subject to the enforcer, who manipulated time by normalizing violence and swiftly quelling any forms of resistance. Nevertheless, when time is weaponized, people are placed in a unique position to resist, often in ways directly related to their own temporal oppression. They use reading, writing, visitation to affirm their sense of self, imbue time with meaning, and make it seemingly go faster. They attempted to control or manipulate time as an act of self-preservation and solidarity. While their interpersonal acts were tied to affirming their humanity, the interpersonal solidarity was tied to the unequal treatment and conditions women endured in the jail. Community organizers and incarcerated persons worked together to bring greater media attention to their plight, especially under the pandemic. Even in the face of an omnipotent and degrading institution and its actor, the women in Broome County Jail found ways to use their time to play, resist, and maintain their humanity. This is how we turn ideas into actions, actions into movement, and movements into policies. It is a gradual process, albeit a slow one. To quote Ruth Gilmore and James Kilgore in their case for abolition, we know we won't bulldoze prisons and jails tomorrow, but as long as they continue to be advanced as the solution, all inequalities displaced to crime and punishment will persist. We're in a long game. Thank you.
All right. Awesome. I'm also going to time myself as well because I can get a little chatty. I'm Sade Lindsay, and I'm an assistant professor at Cornell University. And I'm very, very grateful to be here today with all of these wonderful punishment scholars, read so much of your work, and to really like talk about my own research and also the policy implications of the work that I do. So more broadly, my work looks at how criminal legal system policies and practices impact economic opportunities, health and well-being, and also broader patterns of racial inequality across social institutions. So a lot of my work that I'll talk about today is on prison education programs and their impacts, or sometimes lack thereof, and then also collateral sanctions of criminal convictions, and drug laws and policy reforms. So again, I'm pulling from my dissertation research, which is solely focused on prison education programs, particularly among men. So theoretically, I'm a walker, so let me stay over here. Prison education programs are supposed to alleviate a lot of the labor market challenges that we all know of, right, from David Pager's work and other scholars, Ruben Miller, et cetera. Thank you. And that's because they're supposed to signal that someone has turned a new leaf, right? They're desisting from crime. They also are supposed to signal to employers these job-related qualifications and skills that they have. And that signal, this positive signal that it's supposed to send, is supposed to reduce information gaps, the uncertainty that employers have about whether someone might be a liability or whether they actually have the sort of skill sets, et cetera. And those gaps in that uncertainty that's what's hypothesized to reduce or to fuels employer biases in hiring. However, there's now, especially with Pell Grants being restored, which I'll talk about in a little bit, there's a lot of meta-analyses that are looking at broader patterns, like how these programs are impacting recidivism, but then also labor market outcomes. And what they overwhelmingly find is that people who are holding these credentials are less likely to reoffend. However, we don't see those same beneficial impacts within the labor market, which I tried to unpack here and try to understand why are these credentials, participation in these programs, less effective than we might theorize them to be. So some scholars, they kind of discuss program fidelity. These are more your criminal justice, correctional folks who are studying how well the programs are kind of aligned with the evidence-based strategies that they were built upon. So a lot of them point to this correctional crackery, right? There's this misalignment, and that drives the lack of effectiveness. Other studies point to these methodological limitations. Especially when we have to rely on observational data, and we're talking about prison programs, there's strong selection effects, omitted variable biases that can kind of make it difficult to estimate the true impact of these policies on labor market outcomes. And so what I try to bring into this conversation is kind of thinking about how the credentials are actually working on the ground and how they operate. And a lot, honestly, this comes from the qualitative portion, which I'll talk about, where there might be this lack of signal clarity, right? It's not sending the signal that we think it's sending. In employer recognition, right? A part of signaling theory is you have to, the person receiving the signal has to be able to recognize it as what is intended to be. And so bringing in and kind of complicating how these programs be operating on the ground. So for my dissertation, which this is, it stems from this, I first conducted qualitative interviews with 50 formerly incarcerated men who had program credentials within Central Ohio, from Ohio State, Buckeye. And then for that, I really wanted to understand, right, like, are they using these credentials, right? Like, we're kind of assuming that they're actually signaling. Are they signaling these credentials? How are they using it? What are their sort of labor market experiences like? There weren't studies kind of doing that work. And then I followed up with kind of these kind of typical normative way of estimating effects with like an audit study. And I chose a career path that was kind of heavily offered in facilities. It was a trade versus like a college degree, which we can kind of talk about, maybe some of the differences there. And it was heating, ventilation, and air conditioning in particular. And essentially what the audit study did is, right, vary the credential, and then also I looked at race, black and white, and in particular, to see, right, were these effects different across racial groups. So in the first study, which was published in Criminology, I am drawing from the qualitative interviews, and this is kind of what I mean, bringing in like signal clarity. What is this supposed to be? What is it supposed to be communicating? And a lot of the guys talked about, right, this fear and also experiencing the fact that these credentials aren't actually, they may be sending this negative signal too. And it's because, at least how they describe it, is like it is inextricably linked to their time during when they were incarcerated. And so it becomes difficult to kind of talk about and use that without also signaling that they obtained that credential while they were incarcerated. And a lot of them struggled, and they talked about, right, I think there were only 2 out of the 50 that it's obviously qualitative data, it's not meant to be generalizable in that way, but 2 out of the 50 were able to just enter into their respective fields, and the rest had to kind of make a way, which I'll talk about in a second. But a lot of what I found is that they were coming up with these tactics. Not only did they understand what was going on or what they perceived what was going on, but they were coming up with these different tactics to try to clarify the signal. So they were doing the kind of work to ensure that this is going to send as positive as a signal as I can so that I can get a particular job. And so one of the ways is they're changing, right, how they were kind of noting these credentials on their applications, and kind of trying to manage that stigma that's attached to the different credentials, particularly if there are programs that are offered by the Department of Corrections, and so on and so forth. But even like listing on applications addresses or references, right? All of those things were still tied to the facility and made it a little difficult for them from their perspectives. But in the interviews, they actually used the credentials in particular to really hone in on those positive qualities. We know a lot about these kind of redemptive narratives in the literature, but showing how the credential is actually used as a way to reinforce some of those positive qualities. Nonetheless, like I said, many of them struggled, and so they had to come up with other ways to kind of survive. A lot of them ended up working in like temporary services and thinking that they could kind of work their way up, which really did not happen. Really, it just led to like further exploitation and not even advancing in their particular career paths that they were that had these credentials in. But a lot of folks ended up doubling down. So they relied a lot on reentry organizations for different credentials. And what I mean by doubling down is they're like, okay, I'm really going to show that, you know, I have these positive qualities. I'm going to go pursue like other forms of education outside to supplement, thinking that might help. But a lot of them also ran into some of the same issues that we know of around the barriers to college access, right? You get the same kind of criminal record questions on a lot of college admissions materials and such. And then also student loan debt. I knew that was going to happen. Was a big one. And a lot of them linked that student loan debt to reoffending, which is, I think, important to think about. And then with the audit, which I'll quickly cover, the main point here is if we're looking at these patterns, I wanted to understand, right, how are employers actually responding to the credentials now in a particular field, right? It's kind of very much a narrow and limited way of kind of estimating these effects, but, right, it's a way to add to the literature and add more robustness to our quantitative work here. And so overall what I find is there are these strong, well, I won't say strong, there's a slight positive effect of having this credential regardless of your race and whether you earned it inside, which is good, right? That's kind of what we want. However, you still see the strong race effects, racial discrimination, and then criminal record effects, right? So those are the things that, these credentials aren't addressing those issues, right? They're not really tackling those. Those are the things that we still have to grapple with, and we can't credential our way out of those kind of aspects, at least according to that. And then this is just reiterating the same thing. This is looking at all the jobs, and it's the average marginal effect of having that credential versus not. Reflecting the same things, just throwing it in a model. And then if we look at just HVAC jobs alone, we see a slight bump in that effect. Okay. Oh, I'm way over time. So main points here is, right, we think that they're supposed to be signaling just purely these positive qualities, right? But there's this sense that they actually may be sending some negative or no kind of signal, or not the signal we intend them to send to employers. And formerly incarcerated people having to do a lot of work in ensuring that, or trying to ensure that those signals work. And then for the audit, right, I do find, right, that there's a slight positive effect, but we still have these really strong race and criminal record effects that we have to grapple with and deal with that credentials aren't addressing. Okay. Whew, what does this mean for policy? So I think I actually like how I split this up. I don't like the word pragmatic, but it's kind of like, okay, what are my reformist reforms? What do I think we could potentially do? And then what do I think we should be doing that maybe we may not get there, at least within the next couple decades, who knows? I don't want to be a pessimist, but so the first thing that I think pragmatically, we have a lot of different policies already that are kind of tackling the same issues, right? They're trying to attack these employment issues around people who tend to be or struggle with unemployment. So if there's a way to kind of integrate some of these policies, taking for example the work opportunity tax credit, right? We could find a way to say, okay, if you not only hire someone with a felony record, but you hire someone and you help them, right, get further training, or you hire someone with this credential, right, you get this additional bump, right? We could think about ways to integrate these sorts of policies to bolster these effects. Another thing that came up in the interviews is, right, this like people having or feeling the need to go back to school, right? And the barriers to even doing that, and even some of the letdowns that folks have, which I'm happy to talk about when we discuss. But removing some of those barriers, right? Focusing on removing, right, the need to note your criminal record, and also tuition assistance. And then stuff that we kind of are already doing, but I think building more relationships with employers, but what besides like adding jobs and et cetera, is like raising awareness to these other kind of benefits that might get them over that like hesitation a little bit. There's work opportunity tax credit has a low take-up rate, right? How can we bolster that? And I think some of that is awareness, but other things might be, right, the actual benefits that employers get. Okay, kind of radically, or like what are my kind of big picture things that I think we could do? I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. But I think it's in line with what a lot of folks and what we discussed today is making sure when we are passing policies, especially around education, that money is, and that power is not being funneled into the corrections, Department of Corrections or Bureau of Prisons. And so one thing that I I do like about Pell Grant restoration and the policy there is that the money is going right to the schools and the colleges, and it's by people. There's my timer. I'm almost done. But the other thing is, right, the regulations give the Department of Corrections the power to determine, right, which programs are in the best interest of the students, right? And one, I think this kind of conflict here, right, the resources going one place and then the power being somewhere else can kind of cause this friction on the ground, especially with how Pell Grants are experienced. But, right, I think the money going somewhere else, right, is kind of, we're not continuing to feed the system. But this, right, best interest determination piece could be problematic because it's giving the Department of Corrections more power. And, like, who are they to say, right, like, what is in the best interest of students? And security comes into that, play a lot with that too, I'd imagine. And then lastly, thinking about, right, we have like work release programs, but thinking about what would it look like to have some sort of like prison education release model. A lot of folks are going to get like associate's degrees. We know this 2+2 kind of model. Like, what would it look like to be able to support those students who do have their associate's degrees or about to re-enter to kind of integrate them onto college campuses in some capacity while they're earning like the BA portion. And I think that kind of like that integration, not relying on Department of Corrections and kind of like the whims of if they decide you come into the facility today or not, it could allow, right, us to take advantage of a lot of the important parts of colleges and universities. Housing is a huge one in particular, but also career services and other things that folks need in order to transition. Okay, thank you all.
All right, thank you for these wonderful presentations, really provocative and interesting work, and this sort of wonderful things for us to chew on. So what I want to do is I want to go real fast and then split my time and then give the folks time to respond to a set of questions I want to ask. But if that's cool, is that cool? All right. And so, but first, go real fast is the question. Like that's always the question. I'm gonna go as fast as I can. So the first thing I wonder about, and something that's really interesting about the thing that the three of you do is you remind us to think carefully about how like the form of different institutions. So different institutional forms, and the first one that was raised was immigrant detention. The second was the jail. The third is a social institution. So then, what about the role of education? Or something like housing. In all three, there's an inherent question about like political mobility. Am I not? All right. Yeah. All right. So we're talking about different institutions. So detention centers, jails, prisons, but also social institutions and their relationships. And so on the jail prison side of things, but not detention center, strikingly, if you go outside the U.S., there's no difference between these things. Right? Like everything's a prison. It's short-term remand. And if you go in the U.K., I was just in Nigeria and Lagos doing some field work, and everybody goes to prison for a couple months to a couple years. And I wonder what role these distinctions play in the ways that the institutions are experienced. So because the jail is a different place, does it produce a different kind of violence that if, say, everybody went to prison together? Is it because immigrant detention is different everywhere? There's an immigrant detention center in every kind of institution. So because it is unrelated all across the globe to these other forms of confinement, what violence does that do? And sort of the I can imagine something. I don't want to. I want you. Yeah, this is a question for you. But so and then the second thing in common is a question about like it's not a question. It's not a question. It's the second thing in common, which is the impetus for action across these things. I mean, which is obvious. But there's something really incredibly beautiful about the ways that they're realized across the projects. And so the different kinds of actions initially. So Dr. Friday, who's doggone name Gabriella, I blew, which is the easiest name in the world not to blow. Anyway, but Dr. Friday, community organizing, which is sort of direct action and really interesting, that leads to a policy that could lead to that leads to a set of policy implications. But for Dr. Marquez, there's this really interesting work that is not community organizing. I'm not saying that, but there's other stuff that's connected to it. So like the use of FOIA requests we typically assign with, for example, journalism. So there's question about narrative change, stories. The action is different, and then this is like a very direct kind of policy. Very, very much sort of a policy kind of, if we enact X policy, then why? How then does one evaluate it? So there's action through policy, directly through policy, not to influence policy, but certainly to influence it, but it's the shape an already set of active political decisions. You know what I mean? So, but anyway, these are sort of different forms of action, which I think are really interesting. And all three also remind me of the very forms of control that we see inside penal institutions. And I'm reminded of an article by Nicole Kaufman, Joshua Kaiser, and Ches Rumpf that was published, I think, in Law and either Social Inquiry or Law and Society. And they think about different forms of penal control. So there's sort of interventionist penal control, which they say is accomplished in extra legal ways, is covert. But the one that is striking to me, especially in this case of immigrant detention centers, but also in the ways that time is manipulated. And thirdly, in the ways that prison education happens or it doesn't, and how it happens, is control through neglect. Negligent penal control is characterized by the absence of state actors doing important things sort of on the inside. So thinking about immigrant detention, choosing not to send people to hospitals. But the legal jargon operates in a way that might be more interventionist than negligent in your case. What else? I'm thinking about your work, John. Like what else? It's also funny to me that people call you Eason. It's so funny to me. Anyway, but so like what else? It's all good. I love it. Many ways to express love for John. What else does the jargon do when we think about immigrant detention? This is supposed to be my halfway mark. All right, I'm going to shut up in 2 seconds. A heavily racialized institution, probably more so racialized than jails and prisons themselves. The only place where you get like 90%, right? This is what you say. You say, right? Like the only place, anyway. But what does it mean to like? It seems like there's a CYA kind of role that language plays. Then the last thing I'll ask, and I'd love to hear your responses, are questions about the body, which are fascinating to me. So certainly in the manipulation of time, how is time experienced? She said time is felt. And then these assaults on the body are responded to in ways that affirm humanity through joy, through probably compliments, through collective action that does a thing. What does it mean to do a thing together? Through politics. How does that respond to the body? Then of course the medical body, right? Like what does it mean to be medicalized in a particular type of way? What does it say about our view of the body that you get a Tylenol for cancer? You know, I'm thinking about like a report I read from John, maybe, I don't know, it was a conversation with him. There's you. All right, so I keep reading your stuff, thinking it's him. Anyway, it's not you. Anyway, Betty, you're amazing. So I keep reading it. Anyway, so what does it say about the relationship between punishment and the body? And then the body might feel like it's not so obvious, but the reception of these folks as they show up. So this is more of a human capital kind of question. The human being the corporal side of this thing. And the presumption that human capital is a legitimate way to address any kind of structural barrier at all. The presumption that education will do a thing, be that vocational education or like prison education, something like that. So now I'm talking beyond. But the 5 minutes I planned, I'm 2 minutes over that at least. But the question I was having was, I had this example about education as futility. I mean, maybe not as futility. I think education is wonderful. But I was in Lagos 2 weeks ago. literally 2 weeks ago, and I'm at the first halfway house for women, which happened to open in November in the country. I'm sitting with 3 women. 2 of the 3 have college degrees. But the unemployment rate in Nigeria is so high that it's harder for people with degrees to get jobs than people who don't have them. And they had no desire to get a job anyway. So this relationship between the job and education is fundamentally broken there. It's fundamentally broken here. And so what role then do we think about human capital as an antidote to poverty? What role do we think about education in the longer strain of things? And what kinds of bodies are being produced? What kind of selves is a better word than a body, I think, are being produced through education? And what's the presumption? These women just wanted to, quote, get to market. They were wanting to get back to market, but that market was deeply unregulated, set up in just little booths, right, where folks hawk their wares. But that wasn't about, like, deep upward mobility. They're not becoming middle class, right? In the ways we think about it. They might make the equivalent of $20 a month. Right, like if they're successful in the market, and so it makes me wonder about the human capital and its uses. So I have a minute and a half for you all to respond to these questions. Thank you so much.
I'll respond to the aspects of immigration and detention across. So in Mexico, the Remain in Mexico policies have really exacerbated some of the resources and the confinement issues there. And so how I view immigration detention in Mexico is extremely anti-Black. A lot of the Haitian nationals that are there are suffering in extreme conditions. There was one report that came out, I think it was on Univision or Telemundo, I can't remember, but they found that people were trying to communicate underneath the gates, we're dying, we're dehydrated. And so that was in the area of the Mexican border to the US, but the ones that are Central America, Guatemala and Honduras, those borders are also facing similar humanitarian issues. So I view immigration detention as something that is anti-Black and immigrant, as in we only allow capital, as in money and business, to go through borders, but not people. And so there is a real incentive to keep people dehumanized and easily disposable, so that we can have that cheap labor, but send a message of what happens when you stand up, or what happens when you live freely, or when you leave your guard up. So yeah, the aspects of the body that you were talking about, that control focus, right? You mentioned the Tylenol to the cancer. That's been multiple times throughout many years, various facilities where they just give Tylenol. I think this guy had a stomach cancer, and they were just here's some ibuprofen. So this aspect of power, I especially see when it comes to medical services. And so I'm still trying to grasp with when I read these things that happened 10 years ago. I'm like, it's too late. I don't know what to do with this information. Because sometimes when I'm reading it, it's past that. So trying to figure out a way to consistently, openly talk about it in a journalistic way, but also in a critical way, has been kind of hard to figure out.
Yeah. And so early on, and you were asking what roles does the function of these institutions play in their function and their experience, and I think that ties into the body, because so many of the women that I worked with just kept expressing I just want to get to the next stage. I want to get out of the jail. There's nothing for me here. It's the wasting away of time. It's literally a quote from some of the women. And so for me, the way I see jails functioning is as this temporary quote unquote space, even though again people wait exorbitant amounts of time inside jails for sentencing, for transfer to a state facility, for all of these different things. And I think because of this temporary function of this space, it's why they don't need to have programming. It's why they don't need to do all of these different things. It's why they have even worse medical services than prisons, which, as shocking as that can be, because prisons are already so horrible and desolate. But when you come into jails, you have nothing. Was working with pregnant women who are actively losing weight, who are not receiving their treatment for high-risk pregnancies, all of these different things going on. And so I think that the function also creates it where the women are almost looking forward to getting to prison in a way. Not saying, oh, prisons are great, we love them. Yeah, totally gonna say that here. Anyway, but not saying that that's what they want, but it's something that when they go to prison, they can get some vocational training, they can get substance abuse training, faith-based services, all of these different things. They can actually be moving from multiple spaces rather than just being confined to their pod and maybe stepping out for a little bit and coming back into their same cell. And so the function of jails operates as it's meant to, right? It's meant to be a temporary space that also alters people's decisions making to force them to say, okay, what plea deal can I take so I can get to this next stage, right? What can I do to make this move a little bit faster so I can get out of this temporary but painful and destructive space? And what I'll say that does to the body is it kind of instills like a pedagogy on the body, like in the vein of like Javier Ayero, right? It's literally saying, this is where you deserve to wait. You deserve to sit in this space. You deserve to be uncertain. You deserve to be this because of whatever drug, moral, or etc. crime that you've committed. Like, this is teaching you where you deserve to be. And then on the flip side of that, these resistance efforts where like DG Kelly would call them like infrapolitics, right? These like idiosyncrasies acts that people are doing that affirm their identity and affirm their humanity in a space that is constantly dehumanizing them, right? Like in an article like I currently have out for R&R, I start with a narrative of a woman who's like birthdays are really big days in there for them because they really try to create celebrations. And somehow with commissary purchases, they made one of the girls a penis cake. Another person that I was just messaging said they somehow like did a stripper thing in there, and I'm just like cracking up, like, I don't know how you got a stripper in jail, but okay. But like they do all of these acts to kind of create some sense of normalcy, but also affirm like joy and humanity in these spaces that are constantly taking away from that, right? And it extends beyond like these little like nitty things that like creating crafts or creating cards for people, and it extends into filing joint grievances, right? Like, we are not getting our proper medical services, or we're being held in the same pod, that's the intake pod for new people coming in during like the social isolation phase of COVID, but we're supposed to be outtake, we're supposed to be going outside the jail, we're supposed to be moving to the state facility, so you're actively putting us in containment. So we're going to start filing joint grievances, like the women in the jail don't have the same labor opportunities, right? Which is another way of breaking up the time on the inside. So what they're doing is like we're filing joint grievances saying, why don't we get the same work opportunities? Why are we basically housed in the same pod as new people coming in when the men have separate pods for all of these different things? And from those joint labor, and this is like what I kind of am talking about, like the temporalities of resistance and the temporalities of abolition, is how you see these minor acts that feed into larger acts, that feed into like the community organizing when they start working with us. We see how this happens, and it doesn't always happen in that perfect like little cookie cutter thing, but it's also all of the ripples that are created from these different movements, from these different protests, from all of these different collective actions that allow for it to happen, where Chemung County is now able to open up for in-person visitation and people are able to break up time physically beyond just a computer screen.
Yeah, and I think what comes to mind and thinking about your questions, especially about the body and human capital, something that came up a ton in like my qualitative work is how just disinterested some of the men were in the types of work, right? That, or the types of programs and career paths that were available inside, and how hard that work is on the body, right? And how even like the restrictions, or like how the market is kind of determining what programs are being offered and the types of career paths that people can go down. So it's not like we are getting, right, what do you want to do, right? What kind of careers might you be interested in, right? It's the market dictating the programs that are available, and then they kind of have to just decide, right? Do I want to engage in this kind of work or not? And a lot of them, I mean, there were some folks who were incarcerated multiple times, and they talked about, right, earlier on, or their initial incarcerations, they didn't participate in any of the programs sometimes for that reason, right? The fact that they just weren't interested in that kind of work, like one of the men in my study actually said. And then the other thing that comes to mind is something that I think some critical criminologists are kind of are writing more about, is thinking about like prison education outside of just economic outcomes, right? Expanding like what does success look like? What is the function or utility of education beyond these sort of labor market outcomes? And so in the interviews, especially with this population who have a lot of like distrust in even educational institutions that aren't within, right, the correctional facility, given the histories, a school to prison pipeline, all of those sorts of that kind of history, having those programs available in prison and being encouraged by other folks to participate in accomplishing that thing, right, was a huge boost to their own confidence and what kind of abilities they or like their beliefs in themselves and their ability to go on to pursue education, further education in prison, but then also outside of prison, right? And so like, thinking about not just the economic outcomes, which I focus on here, but also the other ways that education functions to kind of like empower folks, especially, right, thinking about the legal beagles and so, right, like all of these things, that education becomes so crucial to like defending their own rights and all of these other things and supporting each other. So I didn't talk about that, but yeah, those
Thank you so much. Those are great responses. Okay, we got 3 minutes. Can we take 2 questions or no?
I want to ask a clarifying question.
Oh, please.
Sade, did white men who were incarcerated, am I reading this right? White men who were incarcerated had a higher return call rate than black men who were not incarcerated?
Yep.
Okay.
it's like diva pagers.
Yeah. I
Yep.
just had to make sure.
And in response to it, we're going to be like college for all, right? Like, let's go. Once again.
That's one word. That's one word.
Let's go here. Let's go here. Then we'll go there.
Can we take that one?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Please. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for a really compelling panel. I just wanted to ask 2 questions really quick. One about prison education for you, Sade, especially. So I spent some time teaching at MCI Norfolk, and one of the comments that came up a couple times that really stuck out to me was people saying, like, I've lived in Boston my entire life, and I've never had access to professors from BU and tutors from Harvard and MIT and all these places until I got incarcerated. And that kind of shook me a lot, and it seemed obvious, but then also, this is where they're from. And they see that across the river all the time. And so that just like made me really reflect on like where I should be spending my time, and sort of, I just wanted to sort of ask about that. And in particular because I think the guards saw that too and were frustrated because they're like, oh, this is actually seemingly better than what we or our kids have access to as well. And so this program that I was a tutor in, the BU program is now ended, and I think they actually do have a relationship with the guards now, and so there's like some sort of availability to better educational outcomes for the guards and their families, but they're trying to figure out what is going to replace this for people who are incarcerated. I just got this update recently, and so just like trying to think about that dichotomy between like where we're providing these things and when you can get access to these, when you are risky enough to warrant a good tutor is like a thing that I would be curious for your reflections on. And then, Betty, I had a question about, so I went to middle school and high school in Iowa, and so I left to go to college, but I was, aware of these sort of raids that were going on in these like meatpacking facilities and other agricultural workplaces, and this idea of like people cutting off the nose to spite the face, like destroying their entire economy for a town because they're upset about this kind of thing. And I guess that seems striking to me because there is like a very strong economic concern that I would think often would prevent that from going that far. And so I'm wondering, is it like a dichotomy between employers and employees where they have different preferences because of their relationships to these immigrant communities? Was it that the employers like them to be marginalized and it just went too far in that case where they all got caught up? I wanted to sort of get your take on why they're not moderating that given the concern there.
And can we get the next question too, and then maybe the response? Just response? Okay, great.
We got Jenner.
Okay, let's do it. We got a minute.
All right. So that's an excellent question. I think it's something that I currently work with Cornell's prison education program, and it is a huge issue. And we have had to actually hand over like a facility for like our presence in a facility for similar reasons with correctional officers and this sort of hostility toward incarcerated people getting the supports that they should have gotten well before, right, being incarcerated. And so I think it's something that like we constantly have to grapple with, like the politics on the ground and how that works out, and this like ideology of like the zero sum, like if someone else is getting something then we aren't, right, like instead of saying, right, because they are getting something then maybe we should too, right, like thinking about the potential like solidarity that can occur there. But I think how Pell Grants right now, which is like the kind of predominant way that we're thinking about prison education and funding, et cetera, how it's kind of split in that way, where the funding's going to the institution or the schools, which is great, but then the power of like determining which programs can stay in facilities, and which and being able to evaluate those programs. I think that actually might exacerbate some of those issues, like on the ground, like the politics. There's not the money coming into the system, but they have that power to determine who can enter and who cannot, right? And they often kind of wield that, right? Pulling your volunteer status and all of these other ways that they can kind of like wield their power. And so that's not like a satisfactory answer, but it is something that like we are continue to grapple with. So.
Thank you. That might be where we need to cut it. Thanks so much. What a wonderful panel. Thank you.